Hello everyone, viewers. We all know the story of the Tower of Babel, a simple tale of human arrogance, a lesson taught by a wrathful God. But what if that's only the surface? What if the official story is a veil, drawn over a much more complex and terrifying truth? What if the tower wasn't built to challenge God, but to cage him? What if humanity's first great act of unity wasn't born from pride? Today we journey back to the dawn of civilization, to the plains of Shinar, to uncover the story of the day humanity aimed for the stars, and in doing so brought about its own ruin. This isn't just a story about scattered languages. It is the story of a forgotten war, a shattered dream, and the terrifying price of reaching too high. Imagine a world reborn from water. The great flood had receded, leaving behind the cries of the drowned millions were a fresh memory, a ghost that haunted the dreams of Noah's descendants. They were few, a fragile seed of humanity planted in a vast, empty world. But they were united. For the first time, and perhaps the last, all of humankind was one family. They spoke a single language, a tongue of pure, unblemished meaning where a word for a thing was the thing itself. There was no misunderstanding. They shared one mind, one purpose: to survive, to rebuild, to ensure that the horrors of the celestial waters would never again wash away their world. From this unified people rose a figure of immense power, a man whose name echoed with the thunder of the hunt and the might of a king, Nimrod. The Bible calls him a mighty hunter before the Lord, but this is a faint echo of the man he truly was. He wasn't just a hunter of beasts, he was a hunter of chaos, a tamer of the wild, a builder of cities. He looked at the scattered, fearful tribes clinging to the mudflats of Mesopotamia, and he saw not weakness, but potential. He saw a power that, if forged together, could rival the forces of nature that had so recently brought them to their knees. Nimrod's grandfather was Ham, who had seen the face of God. He would gather the elders under the pale Mesopotamian moon and speak with a voice that was both fire and honey. "Remember the stories," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Remember the screams carried on the wind as the sky opened up. We were scattered then, helpless. The waters rose, and there was nowhere to run. We cower under a sky that can become our executioner at any moment. Are we to live forever in this fear?" The fear was real, a living thing that slithered in the dark corners of their minds. They had been promised a covenant, a rainbow in the clouds. But what was a promise against the memory of a world drowned? Nimrod offered them something more tangible than a promise. He offered them power. Their own power. "We will no longer be scattered," he declared, his arm sweeping across the horizon. "We will gather here, in this valley of Shinar. We will build a city so magnificent it will be the jewel of the earth. And in its heart we will build a tower. A tower not of stone, for stone can be weathered, but of baked brick, hard as diamond, and mortared with bitumen, black and strong as the earth's own blood." His vision was intoxicating. A city, a home, a fortress, and the tower was the masterstroke. He described its base would be so wide it would take a day to walk around it. Its peak would rise above the clouds, a man-made mountain, a permanent anchor for humanity. "If the heavens decide to flood the world again," he roared, his voice carrying over the captivated crowd, "the waters will break against our walls. If we are told to scatter, we will have a home to return to. This tower will be our salvation. It will be a beacon, a name for us." The initial motivation was survival, unity forged in shared trauma. They began the work with a fervor that was almost religious. The plains of Shinar, once empty, now swarmed with life. Kilns glowed day and night, turning soft clay into indestructible brick. The air grew thick with the smell of molten bitumen. A new sound filled the world, not the chirping of birds or the whisper of the wind, but the rhythmic clang of hammers, the groan of levers, and the unified chants of a million workers. They moved as one. The language they shared was a tool of incredible efficiency. An architect could speak a complex design, and 1,000 builders would understand it instantly, perfectly. There were no errors, and at its center, the great tower began its relentless climb into the sky. It was a marvel of engineering, a structure that defied the very laws of nature. It grew layer by layer, a spiral staircase to the heavens. From its growing heights, the world below shrank. The great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, looked like silver threads. The world seemed small, conquerable, and when Nimrod stood at the highest point of construction, the wind whipping his robes, and he looked down. He saw not a collection of fearful survivors, but a single powerful entity of his own creation. He had forged them into a living machine. They were no longer just men and women, they were humanity itself, a collective consciousness with one will, his will, and as he looked up into the endless, indifferent blue of the sky, we are the masters of the earth below. We can shape the clay, command the fire, build a mountain where there was none. What is to stop us from reaching the heavens themselves? What is this God that he should rule from a throne we cannot see? Perhaps the sky is not a home for a deity, but merely the next frontier to be conquered. This thought, born in the mind of one man, began to spread like a contagion through the perfect unified language of the people. The tower, with the quiet chants of remembrance and hope, were replaced by booming anthems of strength and self-adulation. They began to see themselves not as creations, but as creators, rivals to the divine. But not everyone was caught in this fever of hubris. There were those who remembered the old ways, who looked at the sky not with defiance, but with reverence. An old seer, a man named Eber, from whom the Hebrews would... He approached Nimrod in his grand pavilion at the tower's base. "Great king," Eber began, his voice thin but clear. "What you are building here is a monument to a shadow. You build against a fear of yesterday, but you are creating a terror for tomorrow. This tower does not reach for salvation. It claws at sovereignty. You teach men to trust in the strength of brick and tar, but you teach them to forget the power that gives the clay its form. Old man, your faith is a crutch for the weak. Look around you, see what unity has accomplished. We no longer need to pray for safety. We build it with our own hands. Your God drowned the world because he saw division and wickedness. I have brought unity and purpose. Surely he must be pleased." "You have confused uniformity with unity," Eber replied, his eyes filled with a sorrowful wisdom. "You have a God of many hands and one mind, yours. And I tell you, the true God does not share his throne. He is not a being you can wall out or a power you can challenge. He is the very air you breathe, the language on your tongue, and when you use that language to defy him, you risk him taking it away." Nimrod dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "Your riddles are for children and mystics. We are men of action, men of substance." They were subtle at first, a strange shimmer in the air at the tower's peak, a faint, discordant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Workers on the highest levels would sometimes pause, a look of confusion on their faces, as if they had misheard an order they had understood perfectly just a moment before. They would shake their heads, and the moment would pass. But the moments became more frequent. It carried with it sounds that were almost words, but not in the language of man. They were fragments of speech, alien and unsettling, that slipped into the dreams of the sleeping workers, planting seeds of unease. People began to grow irritable. The perfect harmony of the project began to show tiny cracks. An argument would break out over a misplaced tool. A foreman would accuse a bricklayer of insolence. He saw these cracks not as a warning, but as a sign that they needed to finish the project faster. Their goal was almost within reach. The tower was now so high that the clouds were a regular shroud around its middle levels. The air was thin, and the world below was a distant, hazy map. The sheer arrogance of the structure was breathtaking. It was a finger pointed in accusation at the Almighty. It said, "We are here. We are one." The Bible says, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built." This was not a physical descent. It was a shift in reality itself, a pressure, a presence. One morning, as the sun cast the tower's monstrous shadow across the plain, a foreman shouted an order to his crew. The words left his mouth clear and precise. But the men just stared back at him, their faces blank. They had heard sounds, but the meaning, the very essence of the words had vanished. The foreman, enraged, stormed over to one of the men and grabbed him by the tunic. He shouted the order directly into his face. The man, terrified, pushed him away and replied in a torrent of what seemed to be gibberish. The sounds were guttural, strange, full of unfamiliar clicks and hisses. Panic began to spread. A wife called to her husband, and he answered in a language of flowing melodic vowels she had never heard. Children cried for their mothers in tongues that were alien and frightening. The single perfect language, the tool that had built an empire, the very foundation of their unity, shattered. It didn't just break, it exploded into 1,000 different forms. Imagine the horror, imagine the absolute terror of looking at communication. The bedrock of their world was gone. The symphony of construction devolved into a cacophony of chaos. Orders were misunderstood. A command to raise a beam was interpreted as a signal to cut the ropes. Massive blocks of brick tumbled from the heights, crushing workers below. Fights broke out, fueled by paranoia and terror. A gesture of help was seen as a threat. The unity that Nimrod had forged was a fragile thing, held together by the single thread of language. And now that the thread was cut, the entire tapestry of their civilization unraveled in a single day. They turned on each other with the ferocity of cornered animals. The man working next to you was no longer your brother. He was a stranger, a barbarian, speaking a nonsensical tongue. He was the other, and the other was to be feared. Nimrod watched from his pavilion as his perfect world burned. He could hear the screams, the shouting in 100 different languages. He ran out, trying to restore order, his voice booming with the authority of a king. But his words were now just another strand of noise in the bedlam. To some, he sounded like he was barking like a dog. To others, hissing like a snake. The people he had commanded, the people who had worshipped him, now looked at people huddled together with the few others who made the same new sounds they did. These small, terrified groups, bound by their new impromptu languages, could no longer cooperate with the others. They looked at the tower with horror. It was no longer a symbol of their strength, but a cursed monument to their downfall. They gathered what they could and fled the plains of Shinar. They went in all directions, north, south, east, west. They became the nations of the world, destined to misunderstand, to fear, and to fight one another for millennia to come. The dream of unity was dead, and on its grave grew the weeds of tribalism and war. And what of Nimrod? The great king, the mighty hunter, the man who would be a god legend, says he was left alone in his silent city of Babel, surrounded by the unfinished corpse of his ambition. He would walk the empty streets, climb the abandoned ramps of his tower, and scream his rage and despair into a sky that would not answer. His own language was now useless, a prison of solitude. He had sought to make a name for humanity, and in the end, he had lost his own. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in 1,000 different tongues, the king who flew too close to the sun and melted the wings of the entire. But it is also a profound psychological drama. The punishment was not a rain of fire. It was something far more insidious. God did not destroy their bodies, he dismantled their minds. He took away the one thing that made their monumental project possible. Understanding, he turned their greatest asset into their most profound curse. Think of the implications. This story tells us that unity at any cost is a danger. It was a unity built on the fear of an external threat and the ambition of a single man. And perhaps the divine lesson was that true unity cannot be built from brick and mortar. It cannot be enforced by a single language or a single leader. True unity must come from the heart, a voluntary joining of different souls who choose to understand one another. Despite their differences, the confusion of languages wasn't just a punishment. Was it a curse, or was it a painful, necessary surgery to prevent the cancer of absolute monolithic power from consuming the human spirit? The tower was a dead end for our species. It was the pursuit of power for its own sake, a path that led to a sterile, uniform existence under one ruler, one thought, one will. By shattering that uniformity, the divine force, perhaps, saved us from ourselves. We have the internet, a global network that was supposed to unite us, to create a global village. We have social media, tools that allow us to speak to the entire world at once. And yet, have we ever been more divided? We speak the same languages, English, Spanish, Mandarin, but we cannot seem to understand each other. We retreat into our own digital tribes, our own echo chambers, shouting at each other across a digital chasm. It warns us that the greatest threats to our unity are not external. They are arrogance, the hunger for power, and the refusal to listen to voices that are different from our own. It reminds us that when we build our towers of technology, ideology, or national pride, and declare that our way is the only way, we are laying the first brick of our own Babel. We are inviting the same chaos that befell Nimrod and his people. Therefore, the blessing must be the struggle to regain it. It is the difficult, patient work of listening. It is the humility to accept that our own language, our own culture, our own perspective is not the only one. It is the effort to translate, not just words, but ideas, feelings, and experiences. True unity is not about everyone speaking the same language. It is about everyone respecting the languages of others and taking the time. We can build a world. All right, that is all for today's video. If you liked this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal myths, please subscribe and give it a like to support us. It helps the channel more than you know. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.